Hello, this is Darren Solden, Economic Development Director at the Manhattan Area Chamber of Commerce, and we're going to take a few minutes to run through additional information about the Riley County CARES Business Grants Program. This program is open to businesses located in Riley County, and applications open online on Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. For more information or to apply online, go to www.manhattan.org/CARES grant. That website is on the screen right now. You'll find the full program description, some forms and attachments to take a look at there as well as the majority of the information that's going to be covered in this presentation. So we'll begin with what is this program? Ultimately, these are federal CARES Act funds as passed by the United States Congress. They were allocated then to the state of Kansas. The Kansas Spark Task Force, this was part of the Spark Phase 1 funding. Then there was about $15 million of that money that was allocated to Riley County. The Riley County Commission approved $2.5 million of those funds to go towards direct aid to businesses. So I want to thank the Riley County Commission for their approval of those funds, and ultimately believe this is going to be an impactful program for a lot of businesses in Riley County. This program is being administered by the Manhattan Area Chamber of Commerce, and ultimately, though, these are Riley County funds, and checks for those that do get funding will come directly from Riley County. So who can apply for this program? As I mentioned already, businesses have to be located in Riley County, so they need to have a physical presence inside of the county. They can be for-profit businesses. In addition to that, 501c6 organizations, so different business associations, membership organizations are eligible for the program. The business has to be in operation on or before March 1st, 2020, and most importantly, it still has to be in operation when grant funds are received. So obviously a lot of different businesses have been through a lot of different things over the course of the last 6 months or so, but the business has to be in operation when it makes the application and receives the funds. So again, in operation on or before March 1st of the year, and in operation currently if they're going to make an application this week. So the business also needs to have experienced business interruption as a result of COVID. That can be demonstrated in a number of ways. Unlike some other programs, there's not a requirement in this program for a demonstration of a specific percentage loss in revenue year over year or anything like that, but there is a written narrative component of the application where the business is asked to describe how they've been interrupted as a result of COVID-19. I also want to note that there are a couple of business types that are not eligible, and we'll get on the following slide to some additional information about size of business and that sort of thing. But in general, some business types that are not eligible: publicly traded companies, charitable nonprofit organizations. So, for example, typical 501c3. There is a program with some of these CARES Act funds that have been allocated by Riley County that's being administered by the Greater Manhattan Community Foundation. If you're a 501c3, I would encourage going to the GMCF website and learning more about that program, and go ahead and apply for that if you are a charitable nonprofit. Also, entities with primarily passive income sources. So most common example of these would be those businesses which are receiving the majority of their revenue from rental situations. So rental properties, whether that be commercial or residential, those types of businesses are not eligible for this program. As promised, a little more information about the size of businesses. This is a small business program. As defined by Riley County, no more than 50 full-time equivalent employees can be employed and were being paid as of March 1st, 2020. So business goes back to that point in time. They need to be able to ensure that there were 50 FTE employees or full-time equivalent employees or fewer as of the beginning of March. A little bit of information here on how to go about measuring an FTE. It's based on a 40-hour work week. So for example, if you have an employee that works 20 hours a week, they would count as half of one FTE. So you need to calculate total number of hours being worked by the employees, divide that by 40 hours in a week to come up with the number of FTE or full-time equivalent employees in a company. And finally, on this note, the business cannot be part of a larger business with more than 50 FTE. So for example, if a business has multiple locations, one of which is in Riley County, that Riley County location may just have 25 FTEs, but overall the company, let's say in 5 locations across Kansas, has 200 FTEs. That particular business would not be eligible to apply in this case. So now we'll jump into some additional details about the grant. And so again, these are grant funds. They have to be used for specific purposes. Throughout the application process, and I'll note this multiple times, but the level of detail required in the application to document the funds or document the expenses that are eligible to receive funds and the payments that have been made on those expenses. That level of detail is significant. And again, these are federal CARES Act dollars, so there is a significant amount of reporting and an accountability that goes along with them. So as far as grant details go, qualified eligible businesses may receive up to $15,000 through this program. There is an additional 10% that can be added to that maximum award. So the maximum award could go up to $16,500 for minority, women, disadvantaged, or veteran-owned businesses. That is not an automatic additional 10%. That still has to be supported with qualified documented expenses, but as long as the business can do that, businesses that are majority owned by, again, minority, women, disadvantaged, or veteran owners may qualify for the additional 10% added to the maximum award. And that information, you check that off on the application to designate that. Of course, that can be followed up on as part of the application process, and it's signed off on the affidavit that information that's been provided is true and factual. So now one of the key points in this entire grant program is when it comes to use of funds and what qualifies. So funds may only be used to reimburse qualified expenses. So this program can only be used, the dollars from this program can only be used for expenses that have already been incurred and paid for. So, and as I noted before, documentation of specific expenses and payments is required. So we'll take a look at some of the paperwork, the forms that go along with that here in a bit. But just to give an example, if I'm paying rent, rent is a qualifying expense in this case, and if I, let's say, include rent for the month of September as part of my application, I would need to provide either an invoice for that rent or a copy of a rental agreement to document the existence of that expense. And then I would need to provide proof of payment. So whether that be a copy of a check, a bank transaction, or some other method of payment, there has to be a receipt and proof that payment has been made. So that's really one of the most important things to remember. Again, I can't stress it enough that as you're pulling information together to make this application, it is vitally important that the documentation is done and that it's thorough and that it is all included as part of the application. If it's not, it obviously has the potential to slow down the process as it goes through review, and ultimately there'll have to be some communication back and forth on getting that information, completing the necessary documentation to complete the application, and ultimately move it towards approval. So on that note, fully completed grant applications, and they are considered fully complete when all documentation is present. The application has been completed. There's an expense log that goes along with the expense and payment documentation, and then there's also a requirement for a W-9 form to be completed and uploaded with the application. So once all of that is done, the application is considered fully complete. and fully completed grant applications will be reviewed on a first in, first out basis until all program funds are awarded or distributed. So I started talking a little bit about eligible expenses or eligible uses for these funds. Remember, the funds can only be used towards expenses that have been incurred or anticipated to be incurred from March 1st, 2020 through November 2nd, 2020. November 2nd is a Monday, so it's the first business day of November. So things like regular operating expenses, rents, utilities, any of those items for the month of November, if paid on November 2nd, would qualify to be covered by this program. Obviously, if you're applying now towards the end of September, you're going to have expenses and payments on those expenses from March 1st through the application date that you can document and should document and include in the application. From the application date moving forward to November 2nd, you may have expenses, qualifying expenses. Many of them may be very much the same, whether they be rent, utilities, payments to suppliers, payments to vendors, purchases of inventory, supplies, those sorts of things. Very similar to expenses incurred prior to the application date that you can provide documentation on. You can also include those expenses going forward through November 2nd in your application. What's going to happen in that case is that there will be a second round of documentation that's going to have to go on at the beginning of November to document from application date through November 2nd all of those expenses and the payments on those expenses, and then the remainder of the award will be dispersed at that time. So those qualifying or eligible expenses include accounts payable, such as utilities, vendors, payments to vendors, payments to suppliers, and other working capital expenses. Payroll is not eligible in this program as defined by Raleigh County. So that's the key thing to remember there. We're talking about non-payroll working capital, or I'm sorry, not non-payroll accounts payable expenses. So again, to keep things simple, keep things straightforward when it comes to documenting all of this, the key will be to look back to the beginning of March and look through to anticipated expenses through November 2nd and pool everything that fits into these categories during that time. Also, rent and mortgage payments are eligible. I had mentioned rent previously, but rent and mortgage payments are eligible. And so are expenses for activities related to adjustments to the delivery of services or products, for that matter, such as personal protective equipment. So that's purchases of PPE, measures to enforce social distancing. So think about everything from signage to maybe modifications that had to be made within a place of business to ensure safety and social distancing, whether that be at a point of contact with a customer or within an office setting. A lot of businesses had to take on those types of measures, and so the expenses associated with those would be eligible for this program. Other things that folks have done, again, these are just examples, not fully comprehensive, but touchless points of sale systems or hardware or software to adjust ordering and sales. So again, adjustments that were made related to the delivery of products or services would be eligible for this program. And again, all expenses would need to have been paid or to be paid between March 1st and November 2nd. So since those are the eligible expenses, obviously there are some ineligible uses or some ineligible expenses. So we're going to run through that. We've got a couple slides worth of those. Again, this is relatively tightly defined, so and that's the point that while there's going to be a little bit of gray area around what's eligible and not, there are some specifics here as to what is not eligible. So first off, to provide funds, whether that be directly or indirectly, for payments to owners, partners, or shareholders of the business. So again, for dividend distribution, return of capital, or other payments directly to partners or shareholders of the business, that's not an eligible use. I mentioned already payroll, so any payroll expense or employee pay, and that would include payments to independent contractors or 1099 contractors and subcontractors. Those are not eligible. Any tax payments, so whether that be at the local, state, or federal level, any expenses related to paying taxes are not eligible for this program. Then additionally, any expense related to financing a business project or activity, or related to a location located outside of Riley County. So if a business has incurred expenses at a location outside of Riley County, they're otherwise qualified based upon having a physical presence in Riley County, based upon their employee numbers. It could be a qualifying expense, even say, for example, rent. But if that was rent for a location, for one of their locations outside of Riley County, or utilities for that location, or payment for inventory, let's say in a retail store that maybe has multiple locations, let's say one in Riley County and one located someplace outside of Riley County, purchase of inventory, rent, utilities, any of those expenses, while qualifying for the location in Riley County, if those were for a location located outside of Riley County, they would not be eligible. So they cannot be added on to the Riley County location. Additionally, any expense already satisfied by either and I want to be careful on how I say this here, but any expense already satisfied by a local grant, or a state or federal loan or grant program. For example, things like the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program. So that was PPP that covered payroll, rent, utilities for a period of 2 to 2.5 months. An SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or any other CARES funding provided through the state. And so primarily that's been through Spark, but that could also include CDBG funds that have been allocated to counties. And it also does include the Spark Phase 2 dollars that opened last month. That was a statewide application process through the Kansas Department of Commerce. And so folks are just now finding out whether or not they're getting those funds or not. So that's something to be careful of. Remember, if you applied for those dollars, you cannot, and applied for specific expenses to be covered by those dollars, you cannot turn around and apply for those same expenses to be covered by this program. That's all coming from the same place. Ultimately, it's all coming from CARES Act dollars at the federal level, and that double dipping is not allowed on federal dollars. So just to give a quick example or two on this, let's say, and these are going to be the most common examples, probably applicable to the largest number of folks, but let's take Paycheck Protection Program or PPP. If you applied for PPP, let's say you got it and you got 2 months worth of payroll, 2 months worth of rent and utilities covered by PPP, and let's say those were applied for the months of June and July. Okay, so those 2 months then, in the eyes of the federal government and the CARES Act funding, have been covered by CARES Act funding. So if that's June and July, you would be okay to apply for funding through this program, assuming no other federal money that has gone to cover expenses. You're able to apply for this program for rent and utilities. Remember, payroll is not eligible, so the payroll piece is off the table. But you would be eligible to apply for rent and utilities for the months of March, April, May. You would not be eligible to include June and July in this application, because those months would have already been covered by your PPP dollars. And then you would also be eligible, obviously, for rent and utilities in the months of August, September, October, and November, assuming you made those payments on those expenses in November, on Monday, November 2nd. So Again, if you've had if you got PPP dollars, or you applied for an economic injury disaster loan and got some funds there, and as part of your application you identified, obviously the economic injury disaster loan is 6 months worth of operating expenses typically. So folks that got an economic injury disaster loan need to be a little bit careful, because if they got those funds, let's say again in July, then you're going forward, and applying those funds, you would not be eligible for any expenses that have been covered by that economic injury disaster loan through the SBA. You could not apply for those in this program. You could apply to expenses incurred prior to that are qualifying and for this program, but not for those that are also being covered by the economic injury disaster loan. So again, that's that entire situation there becomes a little difficult because there are currently programs that are out there, and folks are waiting on answers on those, including that Spark Phase 2 funding that was done through the State Department of Commerce. So please be careful and be aware of where that all stands as you're applying. Finally, any expense covered by business insurance is not eligible. So obviously you can't, some expense, and there's not a lot of these out there due to the current situation, but if it's an expense that you've been covered by business insurance, and seeing a benefit there, you can't include that in this application. And then finally, direct payment of debt. So this one we've had some questions on as well. Just keep in mind that again, if you are mortgage payments are allowable. And then if you have purchased inventory, you've purchased supplies, you've paid a vendor, covered operating expenses during this time, whether any of those things were done on credit or with a credit card, or even with loan proceeds, those would be eligible. Again, you'd have to be a qualifying expense. You would have to document the fact that those expenses existed and that a payment had been made. So those would be eligible, but this cannot be used to make for example, a direct payment of a pre-existing business loan or a new loan that's been taken out during this time since we've been dealing with COVID. Any direct payment of an expense would not be allowed. So a little bit more information on how to apply. We mentioned the website already. Manhattan.org/CARES grant is where the online application will go live on Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. Excuse me. Right now, you can go online to that website. There is a PDF version of the application currently available. Just want to remind you that PDF version is not ultimately what you will submit. So it would be good to reference that PDF, go through the different content fields, complete those so that you have that ready to go. But that will not be your final submission. That's for informational purposes only. Once those applications open on Thursday, the 24th at 1 p.m., there will be a live online form that you'll be entering information into the content fields for the application. So it'll be handy, obviously, if you have that content ready to go, having referenced the PDF that's online, but you will not be directly uploading the PDF of the application. You will be uploading as attachments to the online form several other documents. So first off is a completed W-9. A blank W-9 is available for download on the website. If you do not have one, complete that with your business's federal tax ID number and the rest of the information and have that ready to go. That will be directly uploaded as part of the online application. So that's something that can be completed ahead of time and have ready for upload. Another document that can be completed ahead of time and have ready for upload is the expense log. It's also available for download on the website. We'll take a look at it here in just a moment. But all applied for expenses should be listed on the expense log, and there's some additional information on there that you'll include about each expense and about the payment for each expense. And then obviously, as I've mentioned multiple times, the the need to document that expense. So something like an invoice, a contract, if it's for example, a lease payment. If you don't get a monthly invoice for your rent, but you would, in that case, you would provide a rental agreement or a lease agreement to document what that expense is and how frequently it's paid. So all that documentation then will be included um, with the additional attachments. So, as also mentioned previously, a second round of documentation and disbursement will occur in November for any expenses that qualify and are approved. That will occur between the application date and before November 2nd. So, a little more about that, the actual uploading of documentation. We would ask for purposes of review that, and just because of the ability to upload documents, there will be a cap on the size of documents that can be uploaded. So up to 20 megabytes on those, and then there will also be a limit on the number of attachments that can be included. So in some cases, if you're compiling a number of smaller expenses, obviously you may have numerous transactions that you're having to document, both the expense and the payment on that expense. When doing that, we'd ask that you compile those into so that multiple transactions are showing up within a single document. So whether that is scanned into a PDF or a number of images that are combined into one document, that will be necessary for applicants that have numerous transactions that are part of their application. So once those applications are in, it'll kick into the application review process. There will be an email confirming receipt of application. The email will not be instantaneous. That's going to actually, physically send an email once the application has been received, and goes into the initial application review. So again, these reviews are being done by people at the local level. So this is not something that's getting sent off. This is something that's being administered locally. Be taking a look at those as quickly as possible, but there will be a little bit of turnaround time on processing those applications. The first step following receipt is, as I mentioned, is this initial application review. So checking for a couple things here. First is eligibility. So there's a number of questions at the beginning of the application that help determine eligibility. Is the business located in Riley County or has a presence in Riley County? Does the business have 50 FTE employees or fewer as of March 1st? And then take a look at the qualifying expenses as well. So to make sure that those are eligible. So the second piece of that then is to ensure completeness. So all application content fields have been filled out. There will be specific fields that are required, and you'll not be able to submit the application without completing all of those fields. So that part of it is, for most applications, shouldn't be too much of an issue. Then there's going to be the requirement of the two attached documents you referenced, the W-9 and the expense log, and then the additional attachments, which will be all appropriate documentation of expenses and payment on those expenses for everything that's being applied for. So again, then what is an applicant eligible for from a funding standpoint? Up to $15,000, unless fit into one of the categories, it's eligible for an additional 10% on the maximum. The final amount, had a question from a few folks about, why is there not a how much am I applying for line in the application? That's because the final amount ultimately is determined by the qualifying expenses in the application that are properly documented with both information on the existence of the expense as well as the payment on that expense. So that ultimately is what will determine the amount of award that an applicant is able to receive. So obviously this process may require some follow-up. So we're going to try to do that primarily via email. That's why the email field on the application will be required content field. So we would encourage folks to use a current email address that gets checked on a regular basis and there will be email follow-up that will provide details of additional required action or information needed. In most cases, it'll probably be something related to documentation and meeting the guidelines required as part of the CARES Act and for the federal funding. So again, relatively stringent on that. And the biggest thing that I can encourage folks to do, having been through the process now of formulation of this program and looking at kind of what happens on the back end from a review and auditing process and everything else, the single biggest piece of advice I would give is to ensure that that documentation is on point, and that again, all expenses are documented. They're very clearly laid out within the expense log, and that can be categorized either chronologically, it can be categorized by vendor, by payee. That part doesn't matter as much, but ensuring that all of those are documented in the expense log, and then that there's actual documentation of the expense and the payment on that expense. So with that, we're going to move over to the website. And on the website, you can find a lot of the information we just covered in that presentation, laid out in narrative form. But this is the full program outline, so I would encourage anybody interested in applying to take the time to read through the full outline in detail to fully understand the program and what the requirements are as an applicant, what the eligibility and qualifying requirements are as well. I mentioned that there are some attached documents. Here you can see the application. So this is the PDF. Again, this is just for planning and reference purposes at this point. That will not be directly uploaded as part of the application. It will be an online form with the same data fields, and so that information will be entered into the online form. The expense log and the W-9 will be directly uploaded as part of the online application, along with all of the documentation on expenses and payment on expenses for the applied for use of funds. So again, take a review of the website. You can get to it just simply by going to manhattan.org/CARES grants and get additional information on the full program outline. So want to review one other document here, and that is the expense log. So again, the expense log is a relatively straightforward document. You're just simply, excuse me, you're just simply documenting the date of the payment. Again, these are payment dates is what matters here, less than invoice dates. But you're simply documenting the payment date, who was paid, how much was paid. If there's a voucher or invoice number that goes along with that, please include that. That will help with matching up documentation to the expense log. Obviously, this expense log, it's titled a reimbursement report, but this expense log, if organized in the same order as the documentation of the expenses and payments, that will assist with review and help expedite that process. So we encourage folks to organize things. Again, how you organize, whether that's by date or by who was paid, doesn't matter as much as hopefully ensuring that the information that goes onto this expense report form is entered in the same order as the documentation, the documents associated with documenting this. So again, whether that be invoices, copies of checks, account information, those sort of things, to show that there was actual payment made. So we kind of covered the expense side of it, then the payment side of it. Again, if there's a check number, if it was paid by check or a confirmation number or something like that, will help match up the expense log with the documentation. Payment method, same thing. That'll help with matching those up, and then a quick description of the expense is what needs to be included on this form. So again, they're going to ultimately what you're going to do is complete the online application. Once that online application has been completed, there will be a number of documents to attach to it or upload with it prior to hitting submit. Chief among those, the W-9, the expense log, and then in addition to that, all appropriate documentation of expenses and payments. And again, those documents can be up to 20 megabytes in size, but we're going to have to encourage folks to group those together. So ideally, scan those and save them as files that include multiple transactions up to the 20 megabyte size. Once submitted, there'll be confirmation email when initial application review begins. Following up on that initial application review, either it will be moved into final review if it's fully complete, or if there are some questions about eligibility or some items there that need to be addressed to complete the application, there'll be follow-up with the applicant, primarily via email. That will be the preferred method of communication from the review team. Will be via email, so please be aware of that. Be checking the email account that you put into the application, and be looking for additional communication there. So with that, if you have additional questions, we're available at the Manhattan Area Chamber of Commerce to answer those questions. We can be contacted via phone. That number is 785-776-8829. I can be contacted directly via email. That email address is Daryn, spelled D-A-R-Y-N, at manhattan.org. And again, I would encourage folks to review the website. Scroll back here to the website address so that you can see what that is one more time. It's www.manhattan.org /CARES grant. And that'll give you additional information, PDF copy of the application, as well as the other documents that need to be uploaded as part of the online or with the online application. So if you have additional questions as well, don't hesitate to go to the Manhattan Area Chamber of Commerce Facebook page. There's been a couple posts there with information about the program. Don't hesitate to ask questions there as well. We're keeping an eye on that account for questions as we move towards Thursday. And again, remember, applications open Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. They will remain open until funds for the program have been exhausted, so and dispersed. So, but we do anticipate high volume, high demand for this program, which will result in a high volume of applications. So if you're wanting to get access to the program, access to the funds, please have your information pulled together and be ready to submit on Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. So thank you for taking the time to listen. Hope this has been helpful information, and we look forward to answering any questions that we might be able to answer related to this program. And again, just want to thank Riley County and the Riley County Commissioners for seeing the value in allocating some of the CARES Act funding that came to the county to go towards direct aid for businesses. It's definitely something that's needed, and something that we hope that has a positive impact on a number of businesses going forward. So thank you very much. Take care and be safe.